right, hey, welcome back. Dr. Robert Melillo. This is Dr. Peter Scire. This is the Melillo Method podcast, Everything Brain. And we're here for another episode. And so today we're going to focus on my primary book, Disconnected Kids, which we have the third edition coming out in a couple of weeks. So, yeah, I'm pretty excited about that.
You should be. I mean, after all these years, 2010 is the first time it got published, and then you did a revision of it, and then what? Now it's been translated into how many countries or languages? Sorry,
Somewhere around 18 languages, I think, somewhere about around that now, because we have a couple of new, I get a notice that my publisher has made a deal with somebody. So I think German is coming out this year, and I think there's a couple other languages. So yeah, so that's pretty cool. I was just down with a lot of my family down in Nashville. Ellie was performing, my daughter was performing in Whiskey Jam down there, and my son Robbie was down there, and my wife and a couple of the family members, and it just gave us a time to kind of reminisce a little bit. And my son Robbie told me about how they remembered when they were young, to get them out of their mother's hair, right? I was working a lot in my practice, but every once in a while I'd be like, okay, let's give your mother a break. Or she'd go somewhere, and I had 3 kids, and I would always go to either Borders or Barnes and Noble, especially if it was a rainy day and we couldn't go outside and do something. So I would just go there, and we would just spend most of the day there, and I would let them just roam around and just pick out books, and then we'd sit down, and I'd get a coffee, and they would get like chai tea and chocolate milk or something like that. And I didn't care what they got or what they read. I don't care if it was comic books. My son Ty would usually get comic books, just kind of give them some sort of feeling of love of books. But I would do it because more and more it was a dream. It was a dream of mine to, wow, could I actually have a book here someday or something like this? And it was really, in the beginning, it was this far off dream. That I never would have thought I would have had as a child, really, because it was really something that came about more in my adult years, as I started reading so many books, and as I started developing this whole model that we've of brain balancing and all of those things. It really became more and more really a desire, and the more I read other people's books, the more I had an idea of I wanted to do that. So I would bring them there so I could kind of be immersed by it, and it was kind of my way of trying to manifest it, not even realizing what I was doing when I was doing it. But it also, my kids have fond memories of that. So it really goes all the way back to then, which is really, in the early, really in the late 1990s when I first started really feeling that.
yeah. And so you had written a textbook. You wrote a textbook in 2004. So talk about the differences of approaching writing a textbook, and that had 5,000 medical references in it, now to writing a book for the general public and being able to take very complex brain science and bring it out in a way that the general public worldwide and translated in multiple languages can really understand.
Yeah, well, I don't even know if I've told you this, but the actual story into this actually goes back, and it's pretty interesting. I hardly think about this, but so let's say around 95, 96, 97, I really kind of started having this model in my mind, and we started working with it and seeing results, and I was trying to explain it to people, and I was saying the same thing over and over, trying to explain this model of right hemisphere, left hemisphere imbalances and all of that. And there was a point where, again, all of this that I really wanted to write, and I'd never written anything really. And so I had a patient of mine, and this woman was a writer. She had written a number of books, and she described herself as a bibliophile, meaning that she was always reading and everything. Her first name was Barbara. And I remember telling her, I really would like to write a book. I think I have a good idea for a book. And at that time, the program I had was called Unlimited Potential. So I thought that would be the good title for the book, Unlimited Potential, because I thought it really kind of was a positive message and it was unique. And so I said, I really would like to do that. And she said, all right, well, I'll help you if you want. So I started going over her house on, times and breaks. And again, I was collecting research and data. So on one end of it, I was doing all this research and collecting all this. On the other end, I'm trying to convert this into a book for lay people. So we're starting to do that, and we're starting to write it. And I'm trying to write this book that would be to explain this science to parents. But at the same time, I still have a lot of questions about this science because I haven't completely figured it out. I haven't, and on the other end, I knew that when I did tell people that, some people would immediately ask, well, where's the scientific references for this? Like, what's your basis for this? So we went and we started writing the book, which was really the precursor to Disconnected Kids, because a lot of it was kind of similar. And about halfway through, I realized, you know what? I need to do a more serious book. I need to do more research-oriented. I need to write something that's more looking at the literature. And I also needed to, I knew this would help me understand it better. So in the middle of that, we just trashed that. And I said, this isn't going to work. Because if I come out with this book, and it's lay book, and it's popular, the first thing people are going to say is there's no evidence of any of this. There's no proof, or what's your research behind it. And so I realized that the foundational thing I had to come out with was something that was really based on the scientific literature and was really a high level that really described the neurology. And then I could do a book for the lay population. So that's what led to first then thinking about, okay, how do I do a textbook? And that's what led to that. And then once that was done, that came out in 2004, I knew that, okay, ultimately, now I need to go back to be able to explain this in lay terms for people, and also so that I wasn't saying the same thing over and over and over again to every patient, that I could just give it to them so they could read it, and also give them some real tools about, okay, now you've understood the model, but what do you do about it?
Yeah, because I do remember, one, I don't remember that story, so I appreciate that story, but I remember when the book came out, The Disconnected Kids came out in 2010, that we had stories from centers. At that point, we had maybe like 6 to 10 brain balance centers, and you were able to pull from many stories of the cases that we'd worked with and be able to put it into the book. But the one criticism again of the book at the moment was there wasn't still a lot of research behind, or independent research, or we hadn't published research. We had a couple case studies on the methodology. Well, lo and behold, a couple years later, the revision came together. And you're right, the revision, and at that point you had been able to, you and Dr. Leisman and others had published, several papers on, an N value of 3,000 to 4,000 cases that came through our brain balance centers over the course of 20 to 30 centers by that point.
Yeah.
And now leading forward to this new generation of the book, really being able to rely on what you've been doing the last 5 years or so, which is working on your PhD and completing your PhD, and that whole thesis process of the PhD was really around the primitive reflexes.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of it, understanding it, writing the textbook, and then the goal was to write a lay book. And I still remember, I think we all have significant moments in our life, right? And I think about that dream of writing a book. And I remember I would even say it to my wife sometimes, and I know my wife at times thought I was a little bit crazy, like, because publishing a book, I remember somebody told me when I first came out with Disconnected Kids, they said, publishing a book, getting a major publisher to publish your book is actually harder than anything. It's harder than getting a record deal. It's harder than getting, becoming an actor and getting like a TV series or a movie, or it's really one of the hardest things to do. That statistic was something like 96% of people say they would have an interest in writing a book or would love to write a book, but less than 2% actually ever get anything published. So the idea of actually having it published was kind of crazy, and that there's a whole business unto that self, because you don't just go to a publisher. You really need to have an agent. So you need to get first thing you need to do is get a book agent, and a literary agent. They need to be pretty reputable, and then you have to sell them on your idea, and then they're the ones that are ultimately going to get a publisher to do it. And if you don't do it that way, it's not going to happen, right? And so I remember when I found this incredible literary agent named Carol Mann, who's been my agent here in New York. Fortunately, I'm from New York, so it was, somebody a friend knew her, and I went there, and I know in the beginning she was a little skeptical, like, like you have, no real experience or whatever. Turns out she thought it was a great idea. The time had come and whatever. And so we put together a book proposal and shopped it around. And we had about 10 publishing houses that were really interested in it. But about 9 of them, for one reason or another, it didn't really fit, right? It didn't fit them, or they didn't, none of them said it was a bad idea, but they just, this isn't what we do, or whatever. But there was one publisher, which was called Perigee, which was part of Penguin, who had published another book in this genre that was a very popular book. And the person who was the head of that immediately got it and said, "You got it." So I remember I left that meeting, and a day or two later, my agent called me and said, "Hey, they offered you a book deal." And there was a certain level of advance, which was, a really, big thing for me. And I remember one of my greatest moments is I called my wife up, Carolyn, and I said, "Hey, I just heard from my agent." She said, "Yeah, what?" And I said, I got a book deal. I mean, they're going to do it." I remember she just started screaming, like this really kind of emotional, like, "Whoa," really happy for me, because I don't think she ever really believed it would have happened. And that, for me, was just such a moment that motivated me so much. And then you start writing a book like that, right? Because now you got to write it. And I remember as I'm writing it, thinking, okay, this seems good, and it's flowing out of me, and I think this is going to resonate with people. But you have no idea, because a textbook is a small audience, and it was very different. This, you're trying to go out there to a mass audience, and you're writing what you believe is really going to resonate, but you don't know. And that is that lag between that. And then once it came out, it really met with a lot of really, success and really positive feedback from day one. It was really incredible. And you guys, even when you first read it, said, "Wow, this is really good. This is going to do well."
Yeah, I remember, I still have the yellow version that you sent me. I forget what they call that.
Yeah, galley.
The galley. You sent me the galley. You told me to look at it and read through it, and I have it in my house, and every now and then I look at it as a testament to something, to say, "Hey, I remember when you called me up and said, 'Hey, I'm going to go after this. I'm going to go after wanting to try to write a popular book.'" And all these years later, 14 years later, and you look at the success that we had with the Brain Balance Centers, and you look at the tens and thousands of families that were served by them, and then obviously the families that we're serving now with the Melillo method, the one constant over those 14 years now is really the book.
That book.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many parents come to me and says, "Was Dr. Melillo in my living room? Did he knew exactly?" And I always remember when we first introduced the book to our parents, and you knew you were never going to get dads to read the whole book. But I would always say to the dads, "Okay, will you just read 10 pages for me?" Okay. Or maybe
or the first 4 chapters.
Yeah, or the first 4 chapters. And I remember we used to have these little little printed cards that we would give, because we'd give a book out to every family that would come in to our facilities at the time. And even to this day in my own private practice, I give families the book. But I will always tell the dads, "Okay, I just want you to read chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 tells you, what's happening inside the brain, and chapter 4 kind of just goes over the symptoms, and if you can get that." And I don't think to this day I've never had a dad come back to me, or the most skeptical people about everything come back and say, well, that didn't make sense.
Right. No. Yeah. I have to say, I think that the most common comment that I've always heard from the very beginning was that people would say, wow, this makes so much sense. Like, this is the first thing that actually makes sense. They're throwing all these labels at my kid, but no one's really describing my child. And then you just, like you said, they're like, how did you know my child? I just know the brain and I know how it works. And really even goes back to, like, a lot of people ask me, how'd you get the title? Disconnected Kids. And that really, as I said, the first version was going to be Unlimited Potential. And then after a while, I realized, well, that there's too many people that have that title in different things or whatever. And then we came up with a more, Brain Balance as a kind of a name that made more sense. But the main thing was that the research and doing the textbook and the research that we were coming out with was that there was a problem with what we call a functional disconnection syndrome. But then also, when moms would come in, the most common way that they would describe their children is they would say, this child was just disconnected from me, or, they were kind of talking about that eye contact wasn't the same, and they just were disconnected. They just weren't connected, or they weren't as connected. And so that was just a description that moms or dads gave of their own children and their own, how they recognized that something was different. And knowing that it was this functional disconnection syndrome, I thought it was a great title because it brought both of them together. It brought this thing that, a parent, if they're thinking, my kid's so disconnected, or if their teacher's saying he's not connected, and they would see that, and then also let them remember, this functional disconnection syndrome, which is really, my area and our area of research in our lab and my research partner's area, that really described neurologically what was happening. And I just thought it was just it all kind of came together, and I was like, okay, this is, the name that fits, Disconnected Kids. And it just really resonated with people, and always has.
Yeah, and to this day, we still hear that. I mean, we still hear that, parents will come in and say, yeah, my child is disconnected from their body, or disconnected from our family, or doesn't want to show interest in interacting with our family, or the poor eye contact that we see. So at this present point, we have the new book, and can you allude about what is the difference over the last several years between the second edition and the third edition of the book?
Yeah, well, again, going back, I didn't really, I dreamed about it, but I didn't know if I'd actually ever write one popular book, and didn't know if it would resonate. And one of the things that really kind of helped me realize that it resonated was, that book it takes a lot to write a book. So I remember at the end of when I wrote that book, I was like, all right, I'm not writing another book for probably ever, but not for a long time. And then probably like 7-8 months in, my agent calls me back up and says, hey, they want you to write another book. And I was like, whoa. And she was like, yeah, it's a big deal. Like, this is Penguin. This is the biggest publisher on the planet. And I was like, wow, okay, I don't know if I'm ready. She said, well, you better get ready, because they're not going to ask you twice, right? And I said, okay, well, I do have an idea in my head, because I've been working on this other program, which was more about, that first book was about what's happening in the brain and what can you do about it. But then what we now were explaining to everybody was all these changes they were seeing in their child was so dramatic that they had never seen with any other type of treatment, but they didn't understand it because it could be confusing, because sometimes it looked negative, sometimes it was positive. And so now I found myself constantly, and we were in the beginning constantly telling people, well, this is what you're going to see, or this is why you see that, or this is the developmental stages, and this is the next stage of that development, and this is how the right brain develops, and this is how the left brain develops, and this is what they do.
Yeah, I remember all those panic calls I had to you in the early years of doing the work.
Yeah, how do I describe it?
How do I tell the parent, and you're like, well, this is what's happening, and this is why it's happening, and as the one brain is starting to catch up, and, especially like, for example, the right brain. We talk about the right brain being the emotional brain, and I just had it this past weekend, with a family describing like their child is crying so much more than ever, but they really believe it's this relationship of he's perceiving more nonverbal language now, or he's getting the intonation of their voice, okay? And but at the same time he's crying more, but he's also been very more lovey-dovey with mom,
Right.
and especially even dad. And then I had another a parent that I just started working with recently that only 2 weeks into working with them, and they sent us this wonderful email talking about how the grandparents came over, and the grandparents are the people that are helping pay for the treatment, and saying that they're so excited because their grandson actually finally came to them and actually gave them a hug and actually gave them a kiss goodbye. So,
Yeah.
so when we see this development, especially in the autism population, and you see the changes to that right brain, there was a lot of things that you had to describe in your second book, The Reconnected Kids.
Yeah. So even now, like, one of the first things I tell parents when I meet with them is we're looking for change. I say, remember this. This is your mantra. Change is good, but it doesn't always look good. And if anything, it's more likely, especially when their right brain comes online, to look negative.
Yeah, to be really intense.
Yeah, and because negative emotions or whatever, but it's good. And so that's where that book came about, was like, okay, I do have something that I do want to say. And then that came out. And then soon after that, again, probably less than a year, they said, well, they want you to do another edition of this. Only a couple years in, I was like, whoa, okay. And so then, we did the second edition. So now I think that edition came out in 2016, I believe. And then, just again, recently, about a year and a half ago or so, they came back and said, we want you to do another. It was after the pandemic and everything like that. And also in there, I also had some other books that I did with Penguin, which apparently is pretty unique. I remember I had one, I think when I did, I forget which book, I think the autism book, which was really the third book, because that was about, okay, now what causes it all? So that's where Autism, the Scientific Truth. And I was doing some illustrations with a person, was a graphic designer that worked with Penguin. They had recommended him for me. And I remember at that time I was telling him I think that was like my fourth book with them, because a second edition is like a new book. It's like a whole nother book deal and everything. And he said, wow, that's pretty amazing. I've never heard of anybody that had, two or more. I've never heard of that. Like, I've worked with so many people for the last, 20 years with Penguin. I've never had someone had more than, two books with them, and you have four. Now I'm up to, I think, 6 or 7 with them. So, again, I felt really honored about that, and that really kind of means that this book is resonating. And now coming out with a third edition, and especially now because, publishing industry is suffering. I mean, they're struggling. Not a lot of people read books. People are so more online things and everything. So
Yeah, and especially the whole idea of self-publishing and no one, everybody's saying, well, I'm Amazon #1, but the reality of it, you self-publish something, okay?
Yes.
And you had a big social media push, but it's not like you had a really amazing book publisher come to you and say, hey, we're going to give you a contract to do a big book.
Yeah.
There's a big difference.
Yeah, there is. And so now every book, a new edition of a book has to be at least 25% different, maybe more. So with this book, what I really wanted to focus on was the research over the past 6 or 7 years that we've been doing, and the development of this new model that really called the Melillo method, which was, really stepping into this advanced level. Because with Disconnected Kids and with the first program that I created, it was really geared towards kids that were pretty high functioning. It was geared towards children, first of all, but mostly, grammar school age kids that had kind of ADHD or learning disabilities or dyslexia, maybe some oppositional, some OCD or tic type stuff, but it wasn't, the non-speaking autism or the really severe or the really young child or the adult or the, with bipolar or schizophrenia and one of the things that always upset me, because we would say to people, well, what about my child, the child that's not speaking? And we'd say, well, this model really doesn't speak to that. And even in the book, I had to say, it's not really about, this book is not about genetic issues or brain injury or more severe. This is more about this population. But I wanted to help that population because they were the most desperate, and I felt for them. But I knew I needed to really dive into the research more, and I needed to really do more research into that and really understand the brain, because the mystery of, why isn't a kid with some types of autism, why don't they speak? No one had really, even to this day, no one's really explained that in the literature. And I really wanted to understand that. And then that led to development that you needed to do other things, and you needed to use much more advanced tools and much more widespread. And then connecting that with your work on looking at the immunology at a much deeper, higher level, and looking at really sophisticated lab testing and all of that. And I wanted to, and then my more recent work on really the importance of primitive reflexes and what that meant, and when they're retained, what's happening in the brain, and the research that we just done. And then also even the Harvard research, which, but we didn't include because that was after the second edition came out. So wanted to include, some of that information from that study. So really wanted to add. So this book, we added a whole new chapter and expanded on the primitive reflexes, and really added a lot more to that, and gave people really tools to understand and really assess it, and not just do these exercises that we used to talk about, but really understand how to stimulate the reflexes. How do you work with any level of any age, whether it's an infant, whether it's a full-grown adult, whether it's a child, whether they're really resistant, whether they're non-speaking. How do you work with this in anybody and get an impact and do it the right way? And then, we expanded some of the other understandings of, what's happening with their interoception, and, when we talk about anxiety, and then this right brain type of anxiety that also really have understood much, much better and worked with in the adult population a lot more. And some of the expanded concepts that you've kind of talked to me about, and that, Dr. Yannick and Karazian has talked about on the neuroimmune piece. And that's kind of led to where a lot of our research is going now. So that's really what's different in the book, is that there's a lot more updated information, such a greater understanding even than ever before of really what's happening in the brain, and how we have this other model that now deals with it in a much more clinical healthcare, model, with all these different sophisticated tools that we now can bring to bear.
Yeah, because it's one thing to write a book and have, each generation of the book, you were able to provide more current research. I remember in the expanded edition, in the second edition, you were able to talk about Marcel Just's work at Carnegie Mellon at the time. It was really big, and Eric Corsese, who was writing a lot of research then about functional connectivity and autism and dyslexia. But now it's a whole other thing to write a third edition, and a large share of that research be your original research, which now is what allowed you to earn your PhD. So now the big criticism for a long time was always, oh, he's a chiropractor. And what's a chiropractor got to do with ADHD?
Yes.
Where now it's like, no, I have a PhD in neuroscience, and here's all the research and my labs that I have that are doing this work and helping me publish this work.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it's a really important thing that you bring up, and that is when I wrote the first textbook, you remember somebody that we thought was really doing cutting-edge stuff was Dr. Martha Herbert. She's a pediatric neurologist out of Harvard, and she was really one of the first people talking about the metabolic aspect and the neuroimmune piece of it, and how, that was actually part of autism. It wasn't just a whole separate thing. And she, as a traditional medical neurologist, seemed to get it in a way that the typical medical world wasn't getting it at the time. And I remember that when I had the textbook, that she did an interview with Jeff Bland, who Jeff Bland is the guy that really started the whole functional medicine movement, and was also somebody that we really admired
Yeah,
and
the
looked up
founding
to.
of Institutional Functional Medicine, IFM.
Yeah. And he would do these great interviews with these incredible researchers. And so I remember I heard that he had interviewed her. I didn't hear the interview. I didn't do it. And I remember one of our colleagues came up to me and said, she mentioned your book in her lecture, in her interview. And I went, what? He said, yeah, she actually mentioned your book. She mentioned that the best book she's ever read on any of these issues was this book called, the Neurodevelopmental Disorders of Childhood from an Evolutionary Perspective, your book, right? And I was like, oh my God. So then I got a copy of that and got a transcript of it. And sure enough, she had mentioned that in the book, that she said it was the best book that she had read. And so then we were both at Autism One conference. And I remember I came up to her, and I was with Jeremy Fritz, our friend from, was in Chicago, and he was with us. And he was holding the textbook. And so I wanted to speak to her after she spoke. So I went up to her. And as we were walking up to her, she saw the book in Jeremy's hands, and she said, why do you have that book? And he looked at me and he said, he wrote it. And she looked at me, she said, you wrote that book? I said, yeah. She said, that's an incredible book. And I said, yeah. So we started talking a little bit, and she said, I told my colleagues about that book. I said, you got to read this book. It's just really amazing. And, in the book, the textbook, the way a textbook's written, they don't talk about your degree, meaning that it's just, this is Robert Melillo wrote the book with Jerry Leisman, and doesn't talk about, what your specialty is or anything. It's a little different. Most people don't know that you really don't. So it's kind of
good.
Just
reference the lab that you guys were associated with at the time.
Right, just open-minded, right? Yeah. And that's one of the things when the publisher first published the book, they said, we like this book because it speaks to any specialty. You're not focused on one specialty. You're talking about everything. And so she said, yeah, and I mentioned to my colleagues, and then my colleague said, well, he's not from a major university, so, it can't really. And she said, I told them that actually the freshest ideas come from outside of the major universities. And so this is a thing that, for me, that's one of my proudest things that people use to kind of criticize me. Oh, he's not from Harvard. He's not from Columbia. He's not from a major institution. And yeah, I have degrees from universities and, whatever, but they're not, like the top in the world. They're okay, but it doesn't matter to me. That's not the point. The point is, what I'm most proud is that most of this I taught myself. Most of this I put together myself from learning it. Nobody taught me this in a class. I was able to take the information that's out there that were written by people from Harvard or Yale or Columbia or MIT, whatever, and I was able to synthesize it in a way that none of them ever have. And to me, that's my proudest thing. So, when people say, well, you're not from a major university or you're not from Harvard or whatever, I'm like, yeah, and I'm damn proud of that because I did this on my own. I did this with a basic degree. So you can get, you could get somebody that went to a junior college or something like that, and they can go on and do great things in this world, right? You're not limited by that. And in fact, most of the people that I know that are really super successful in life did not go to a big university, or maybe didn't even go to a university at all, but they created something of worth. And if you look at, people like Elon Musk, or you look at even, Bill Gates or whatever, they all dropped out of school, even if they went to Harvard. They dropped out early, Steve Jobs didn't go to a great school. So, it didn't really matter that much, but that's the thing that people will still look at and say from a critical standpoint, oh, you didn't go. So I'm here to say that if you're out there and just because you didn't go to an Ivy League school or Stanford doesn't mean anything. In fact, you may be more likely to be successful because, as Martha had said, those major universities are so conservative in their thinking. They don't really allow for a lot of people. Don't realize that they're so conservative because they have a certain way of thinking, and it goes back, and they have a reputation, and they're so tied into mainstream medicine or they're not really doing a lot of innovative work at the major universities. So the innovative work, the real innovative work in healthcare especially, is being done really by individual clinicians or by people out there in private labs. I remember the guy that did the Human Genome Project, the person that really put it all together. It was really actually primarily done in a private lab. And he actually said that. For years, he had tried to get it funded, and that, he couldn't get grants because it was too outside the box. It was too innovative, the thinking. And if it didn't fit in this mainstream box that they were looking at, that were major universities, you couldn't get any sort of government funding for the research. So the only option you had was to go out there and get people that would privately fund it in a private lab. But because of that, he was able to come up with things that they never would have come up with in a major university. So for me, that's one of the things I'm most proud of, in that we have our own lab, that we are connected with the university, but it's really more of a private lab, and we raise a lot of money for research, from private sources, not from government funding, because they're not going to fund the most innovative stuff, and most people have no idea about that.
Yeah, and for someone who's been right there close to you over the years, who's been able to see you with the likes of Dan Siegel, Lou Cozolino. We had Martha Herbert at our conference several years ago, and we had some of these other big names in the neurology space that came to the conference, to the organization that you started, because of the fact that they were able to be innovative, they were able to share the new stuff, their new thinking, and not feel like, okay, they're going to get criticized off stage because the status, hey, we don't want any innovation. No, these people came to us because they saw clinicians and researchers communicating with each other in the same language and saying, okay, we got this clinical people over here doing some cutting edge stuff. They didn't know that the research didn't know that these guys knew their work, okay, and we were trying to apply their work. So it was a really cool dynamic that we had for many years at the conferences that you created, where we could share that information and get to collaborate with people like Marty Teicher and others.
Yeah, because, especially because I think a lot of the people, one of the things that drives them is, whether it's somebody like Lou Cozolino, who's really in the psychology world and looking at therapy, or, Teicher in that group, they were looking for things that were outside of traditional, pharma therapy, right? So really most of the research that's out there, a lot of the funding goes towards genetics or to looking at drug interactions or looking for a new drug. And there's not a lot of money available for research that isn't in those areas. So, which is where most of the real innovative work is going. Like how do you actually directly stimulate the brain, or even in the diet and nutrition. And if you're taking a supplement and you can't convert that into a drug, you're not going to get a lot of money for research on that, right? So, the idea that, looking at how we're taking work and using it and putting it together in unique ways and outside of that box. And that's one of the things that, the United States today, without a doubt, still has the most innovative healthcare system in the world. And really, I thought it was great because Robert F. Kennedy recently really talked about that, how in the United States, we have great traditional medicine, and even the traditional medicine is more innovative than any other traditional medicine around the world. But we also have this robust group of people that are outside in the alternative medical world that are the most innovative healthcare people in the world. And we're part of that, right? And we're really leading the way in making changes. And that, is really, again, I'm very proud of it. And just the fact that, we are able to do all the research that we did do, get it published in major journals, top-tier journals, and have the major publisher in the world now having a third edition of this book. Obviously, it's resonating. And so, yeah, you don't have to go to Harvard. You don't have to go to Yale. You don't have to go to Stanford to be able to really do something in the healthcare field and make a difference and really change the world. And, I think the impact that we've had, and this is just the beginning, because now we are actually changing thinking. I mean, this is really starting to become a movement, a worldwide movement that we're involved with, and I can see it just building, and I see where it's going to go over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so you start out with an anecdotal process that you saw early on in your career where you had your initial group of families and you're working with them and you're developing this model. And then you say, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to start teaching it. You start teaching it to clinicians like me who started doing it in the early years and we're starting to get the same success that you have. Then you launched this whole concept of brain balance and got that up to some 75 to 100 centers over a 18-year span, and looking at the tens of thousands of cases that they had. So along the way, we just started producing reproducible results over and over, regardless of who was providing that program, that it was built on the principles of the Melillo method and process. And now, in the last, say, 5 years, you've just had this major run on research papers to show that, okay, yeah, it's no longer anecdotal. Okay,
Right.
here's what we can do. We now know that with this process, we can truly change the brain. We saw all the anecdotals, we saw the changes in cognitive changes. We could see pre and post neurocognitive testing. We could see pre and post changes on questionnaires. We were using the most standard questionnaires at the time. But that jump that we did with Harvard, where you were able to show pre and post changes on fMRI studies, and now what you've been able to show in your lab over the last several times, and you, as we alluded to several podcasts ago about how you got published in the British Medical Journal, that's not an easy journal to get published in, and you were able to show, okay, in 3 different instances, in 3 different age groups of autism, how you were able to change the brain on multiple dynamic levels.
Yes. Yep. And that at a certain point, I always knew that we needed to do the research, we needed to prove it. And we have at this point. And I think we have, I think I have something like 100 publications, and a number of them are actual outcome where we've done the actual research, randomized, age-match controlled, double-blind studies, and now we're actually even doing the second tail of that. So we've actually utilized the best model, which is not easy to do, actually, when you're talking about in the neuropsychology mental health world. It's not easy to do a double-blind study. People think...
Yeah, this is different than a drug company being able
Yeah.
to get an N value of 1,000.
Right.
You're not, in neuropsychology, you're not getting that kind of N value in research studies.
Yeah, no, most of the research in neuropsychology now is really looking at maybe even individual cases or a few cases, and looking at the individual person as their own control, meaning we did this, we tested them, we found a baseline on whatever testing we're doing, then we did this intervention, and then we looked at them after and we saw changes in those objective measurements. And that's where those 3 cases were, but that was part of a larger randomized age-match controlled double-blind study. So we've done that all, and that was, the funny thing is that when we first came out with this book, 2009, 2010, whatever, because there wasn't a lot of research there, even though everything I'd put together was based on compiling all the research that was out there in the brain world, but we didn't have our own outcomes measures. People would write stuff, and I remember there was, so much coming out on the internet. There was this one, stupid website called Neurobollocks or something, where they basically said, they tore it apart and said, oh, it's complete bull. It doesn't make any sense. And then there was even an NPR article. I mean, and it's so funny because the criticism at the time was, well, there's no research to support this, and this doesn't make any sense. And now looking back, now we've done the research and we've proven all those people wrong. But, people still go on the internet and go back and 10 years ago, there was this article that said that what you were doing. I was like, have you actually read anything I've read in the last 10, 15 years that really now has actually proven all of that was wrong? Any of the critics that we had in the beginning, we've completely really made them look foolish.
Yeah,
Because
I'm always proud when I can sit there and I literally on my desktop, I have folders based on the topic, ADHD, Dr. Melillo's ADHD papers, his autism papers, your textbook chapters, your other papers. And that any parent that asks me, for research, I can send them that folder. And I just recently did that to a family, and parents, dad came back and said, I don't have any questions. Let's go.
Yeah. And the cool thing about it is that when you come up with an idea and you put something together in a unique way that no one's ever done before, and you come out and you say, if you say stand on stage and do a lecture or whatever, and you say, hey, this is how it works. And, people are going to say, well, what's your reference for that? And you don't have a reference because you put it together in a way no one else has. But then when you write it in a paper and then you actually prove it with research, now you've actually added something to the scientific literature that no one's ever done before. Yeah. And now all those people that have studied my work or learning my work or that I've taught it to, now when they get a question that says, well, what's your reference for that? They can say, read this paper, read this ADHD paper, or read this paper on autism. And, in it, Dr. Melillo and his lab and his colleagues, they describe it and they've actually proven it. Yeah. And that's really cool because now you're not just recapitulating what's out there. It's like in legal terms when you create a new precedent and then you actually, then it becomes case law from then on in. Because now you've changed it and now you've made an impact on science.
Yeah, just like last week when I texted you and I told you that I was Googled, or not Googled, but PubMed primitive reflexes, and who was the first paper that came up, the most cited paper, because that's how PubMed is working now, is that they'll always promote on a topic the most cited paper, and your primitive reflex paper from 2 years ago is the most cited paper. And then you start reading current papers that are coming out, and lo and behold, who's usually the first reference that they're quoting is your papers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that, to me is just, I can't tell you how satisfying that is. And most people, I think we talked about this before, to me, a rock star, like when I get excited and like giddy when I meet somebody, it's like a researcher, it's like a researcher that we've read their book or something. I'm like, oh my God.
Just like last night I texted you, like Causalino's got his new book coming out. So we're like, oh yeah, we got to get this book.
Yeah, I could be down in Nashville and run into some big, famous musician and it doesn't affect me. But I see a researcher and I get like I fanboy on them, whatever. And, so looking at that is just really cool. And to know that person then may actually use my research in their research in some way is just, so cool. But to say that, and there's other people in the primitive reflex world that were really even earlier pioneers than me, people like, Sally Goddard and Peter Blythe and other people that really did some good work, but no one really did the actual research to really say, okay, this is really high level research. Again, never did a really double blind study or really even explained what was actually happening neurologically and how that impacted the brain. And so, to do that, and I actually sit there now when I'm talking to patients and I'm talking about this and I can literally say, I said, I'm kind of like the world expert right now on this. And then you tell me, well, if you pull up your paper, you're actually number one in PubMed. That really says something because it also, I'm going to be honest, it bugged the hell out of me when somebody would come out and criticize and say, and I didn't have a backup answer for it. Like I knew I was right, but I didn't have the research yet. And, they would say kind of nasty things or imply nasty things.
The amount of arrows that you and I took in our early years of doing this together, the amount of times I'd be on stage at some conference or whatever, and people would come up to me at the end or want to challenge me. And I look forward to it, honestly. And at the time we had, obviously, all the other researchers to try to connect the dots, but that wasn't enough for them.
Right.
They didn't, well, where's your control? Where's the end value? Well, now, fast forward all these years, we have that, but then, coming from the centers, but we also have all the original research now coming from your lab. So what's the plan now with the book coming out in August 6th, I believe is the publishing date for Amazon. So are you going to do a book tour? Or, what's the next thing to promote the book?
Yeah, I think, nowadays it's really about promoting it digitally. So we're going to be putting together videos that we can then share on Amazon and other places and on my social media. Obviously, my Instagram page is really very active. So I have.
Yeah, you're getting up there. You're almost going to be at 1 million followers here soon.
Yeah. So I have a plan. We have a plan where we're putting it together. Actually, they're coming and doing a lot of these videos. I think in the next 2 weeks we're going to do that, and then they're going to package it and put it out there. And then obviously I'm doing more like a virtual tour with a lot of podcasts that I'm going to go on and talk about the book. But then we're doing a book signing down in Atlanta that I'm really excited about in October. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, over the years, you just get those serendipitous phone calls. And we got a phone call from a dear friend of ours, Tila Kane, who was very involved instrumentally in the early social media aspects of our brain balance centers in Atlanta. And hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her in a while. And I got a call about 2 months ago, and she's like, "Hey, got an idea." And she's like, "What's Dr. Melillo doing for the promotion of the book yet?" And I'm like, "I don't know yet." She's like, "Well, I'm in, opening a new bookstore with Shelley Brown, Zach Brown's ex-wife, and we're going to do it. We're building it in this beautiful community called the Town at Trillet." And for those who don't know much about the Trillet community, it's tied to the Trillet movie studios there in Atlanta, right outside of south of Atlanta, about 20 minutes south of Atlanta. And that's where all the Marvel movies were made. And really now they talk about Atlanta as like the Hollywood now, because there's so many shows for Netflix and every other streaming service that's using this studio. And not only is this studio there, but it's also in conjunction with the Trillet Foundation, which was started by the Cathy family of Chick-fil-A. And so Tila came to me and said, "Hey, you think Dr. Melillo would be interested in?" And we got on a call with you, and we got on a call with these wonderful women. And next thing you know, when we now have this big event where we're going to be doing 2 masterclass over a day, where we're going to be able to really explore the concept of your work, but also not only just for children, but really how it merges into the big picture for everyone, that everyone should be really looking at their developmental brain asymmetry. And whether you're 30 years old or 40 years old or 70 years old, can we look at it from a hemispheric perspective and apply your work to a variety of populations outside of just children?
Yeah, I think it's a great foundation, and obviously, as you said, it's in that, it's in this new up-and-coming area where, it's a very strong artistic community, but it also has a mission to really, that foundation, I think they really want to do some good things. And then we get to, work with some people that we knew in the past that are really good people, with Shelley and with Tila. So it's really exciting, and I think that, this book coming out, so the new edition will be out, I think, August 6th. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. And, I think, again, the book is more popular than ever, my old book. And now this new book, I think it's already, at one point, was on a bestseller list just on pre-sales. So, think 15 years later that it's actually more popular than ever and gaining popularity. But we are going to be doing kind of like a virtual digital tour, and then we're going to be doing this live book signing, book kind of presentation down in Atlanta in October. And if anybody wants to come down and in that area and see us, it would be great to support this foundation and what we do. So I'm just excited and so grateful. And, I don't even know if there'll be a 4th edition, but I can't even think that far down the road. But I'm just really happy of this, and, just to see where it's gone and how many people and how it's resonated with people in multiple languages. And that's the next thing. Anybody out there, that the 2 languages we want to do, though, Italian and French. Those are the 2 that haven't been done yet. And they read a lot, those people. So anyway, but thanks for talking about this. Thanks for bringing it out. Thank you for anybody that's listened to this podcast. And that's been great.
Look forward to it, and I look really forward to our event in October.
Yeah. All right. So we'll see you in the next podcast. Thanks. Have a great day.